Welcome to another episode of the Monocle Banking Podcast, your weekly dose of finance, economics and trade across the African continent and beyond. As always, I'm your host, Michael Avery, and today we're exploring the expansive landscape of Africa's export potential and competitiveness. As we know, Africa isn't a country. Now, the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, BADIA, recently released its inaugural 2023 Africa Export Competitiveness Report at its 50th anniversary celebrations in Accra in Ghana, and the report offers some very interesting insights into the export capacity of 30 African countries, exploring some of the key factors as well as the obstacles that influence Africa's ability to compete on the global stage. Joining us to unpack the findings of this really interesting report and discuss its broader implications, I've got two esteemed guests today, Dr. Amit Kapoor, who is the research lead for the report and Honorary Chairman of the Institute for Competitiveness in India, and Tiekie Barnard, the CEO and founder of Shift Impact Africa, which is an organization dedicated to creating shared value and sustainable growth across the continent. Dr. Kapoor brings a wealth of expertise in economic competitiveness and strategic thinking, while Ms. Barnard offers a unique perspective on why such research is essential for Africa's development, especially from a shared value perspective. So, great pleasure to have you both on the show. Firstly, maybe just as a way to ease us into this journey, Dr. Kapoor, could you just start by sharing with us your career journey and how that led you to your current role?
That's a fairly interesting question, Michael. I can just spend days on that. But very quickly, I did my PhD in industrial economics, became a professor back home in India. And then I started working with Professor Michael Porter from Harvard Business School in about 2003. Started teaching his course on microeconomics of competitiveness, and then, of course, created the Institute for Competitiveness in India in 2009. And then that is from where we did a lot of work on economic geography in India, and of course, working across the board and across countries in terms of understanding how economic development happens. And as we were looking at this in the recent past, I've done the competitiveness roadmap for India. Did a book called The Elephant Moves, which talks about how India can actually progress to being the competitive nation by 2047. Have done work on economic history of India and so on and so forth. And in between, I also end up teaching at Stanford. I launched a course on understanding modern India at Stanford, and I also teach a course there on innovation and competitiveness. So this is broadly who I am and what I've done over a period of time.
Which really doesn't do justice at all to what has been a really esteemed career in the fields of innovation and competitiveness. And as we know, Michael Porter very famously, through his 5 forces, spoke about how we create shared value. It really was an evolution of his work on competitiveness and economic development. And he argued very much that the purpose of a corporation should be to create economic value in a way that also produces value for society by addressing its challenges. And, Dr. Kapoor, just to stay on that point, that really makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? As an entrepreneur, you look at the world and you see problems and you think, well, I've got an idea that can help solve that problem. And so you're effectively creating a kind of shared value model in the realm of entrepreneurship.
That's a fascinating point. And if you really look at Mike's work, there's been 2 pillars in terms of understanding as to what economic development means. Like when you talk about economic development, it only does not mean economic prosperity. It also means social progress. And when he was talking about issues of social progress, wherein he said, okay, now let's look deeper in how corporations can actually create an impact. And when corporations really understand the solutions that they can provide for the problems that exist in the world, that's where they become resilient. That is where they make society a better place. That's when we are able to enhance the quality of life of our people. That is when we are able to enhance opportunities for people. And that is what that whole construct of shared value was. Of course, he created a framework in terms of understanding as to how do we create shared value. But the broader sense was, at all points in time, is economic progress and social progress, and that deeply embeds in that thinking. But today, the challenge that we see in the world is that the capitalism is not really looking at that. We need to focus on those principles in terms of understanding what are the issues with people, what are the issues with population, and how we can really enhance and make their lives better over a period of time.
And to segue into your career, Tiekie, what motivated you to then incorporate this thinking and this focus on competitiveness and shared value in the work that you're doing at the moment?
think if I can take a step back, Amit and myself met through Michael Porter and Mark Kramer, because we both part of the Shared Value community, the Shared Value Institute, actually, that Michael Porter started, I think in 2011, was it, Amit?
Yeah.
So both of us are part of that particular community. And how I ended up taking this route is that I sort of fell in love, Michael, I have to say, with the concept of creating shared value, because a lot of people sort of align it to our Ubuntu with that sort of economic slant on it. Because I think if you look at the Africa continent and you look at the creation of shared value, I think it's always been there, but I think that we just have to remind ourselves all of the time. We started 6 years ago, the Shared Value Africa Initiative, it was called then. Mark Kramer at the time flew out to South Africa when we launched it. We have recently opened an office in Nigeria, and we've got one in Kenya at the moment. And I guess for me, Michael, it was born out of a passion for the Africa continent, because I believe, and the dream is that one day every single company on the Africa continent will practice the creation of shared value. There's some great examples on our continent. You know, we're sitting here on Africa with two of the world's biggest global examples, I almost want to say. Discovery.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Safaricom in Kenya. I mean, Safaricom in Kenya, they contribute 5% to the country's GDP at the moment. So it's, you know, those two examples for us as Africans should be, you know, a guiding force, because both of those organizations are very successful. At the core, I mean, we were in Nigeria with Safaricom, and they presented part of their, just to show the audience in the room, that part of their strategy is focused on creating shared value. You know, nothing in that organization does not see the, you know, new products don't come to the fore unless they actually transform lives.
I still get this sense, and it's such an important point to unpack, and maybe it's a communication issue, that many outside of practitioners in the ESG field, for example, still see a trade-off, an either or. It's either sustainability or it's profitability, and you're going to have to lose some profitability if you're going to do things in a sustainable manner. And, you know, to some extent, reading Let My People Go Surf by Yves Junod of Patagonia, he did say it was difficult initially, looking through his supply chain and sourcing more sustainable cottons and dyes that didn't have some of those very terrible chemicals of the environment. Initially did come at a higher cost, but over time the volume started to kick in, and in fact the sales increased because of that commitment to more sustainable practices. So it did actually lead to increased profitability. How do we approach this in Africa, where some might argue that a focus initially on shared value and sustainability could slow down economic growth, which is so urgent right now? Is it a trade-off?
I think on the Africa continent, Michael, what we've seen, that shared value is not a short-term fix. And that's always the problem, is that we're chasing short-term profits. And it's when you look at creating shared value, as you just said now, Michael, it's a long-term commitment that you make to your organization and to your operations and to all of your stakeholders. So companies need to consciously and intentionally move from a profit focus only to a profit with purpose. And I'll never forget it, because Professor Mark Kramer from Harvard always used to say to me, Tiekie, companies need to realize that they can profitably address societal issues through the core operations of the business. And the thing is, Michael, is that there's still a mind shift that's needed, you know, and I think that makes our work so important, is that we've got to continue to move the dial, you know, and shifting the mindsets to that profit with purpose focus.
And why we need examples, successful ones like you mentioned in Discovery and Safaricom, and there are many others as well. Amit, just to bring you in, so then what led you to working on this Africa Export Competitiveness Report? I mean, on the surface, it's quite clear we as a continent need to think very deeply about how we trade externally with the rest of the world, but also internally. Intra-African trade just isn't at the levels that it should be. If you look at Europe, for example, what did you really set out to achieve in studying Africa's export competitiveness?
Michael, this was a fascinating question that I was asking myself, like as to why Africa. And if you really dig deeper, what we do notice is that China has been doing stupendously well over the last few decades. Then India was also emerging very, very strongly. But what is going to be the epicenter of growth in the coming years? And it was very clear to me that the epicenter of growth in the decades, once India is developed, like say in the next 20 years, it's going to be Africa. It's going to be the African century. And the reason was very simple. If you start looking at the numbers for Africa are very similar to what India is all about. Like, so 1.4 billion people is what you have in Africa across 54 countries, of course, 55, and then $2.8 trillion as its GDP. And India is exactly around there for about 1.45 billion people, and then about $4 trillion as the economic might. But if you really look at it, like where is that growth going to happen for Africa? Africa is young, without a doubt. Per capita incomes across Africa are fairly low. It's close to about $2,000. So that means there is a huge potential and uptick that Africa is actually going to see. And Africa also has a problem. And the problem within Africa was that you have some pockets of great excellence. You have South Africa, which does exceedingly well. You have the island nations within Africa, which do very well. But then you also end up seeing some huge set of issues in terms of the violence that happens within Africa, the coups that have actually happened in Africa. So this makes it like the reason to really understand was, why is this all happening? What is the reason that this Africa suffers from such kind of a situation? Like it has an amazing possibility in terms of what resources it has. So it has a suffering from what I would call it the resource curse. So what needs to be done further? In terms of like, so if you really look at it, like the continent today holds 30% of the world's mineral reserves, about 20% of the global hydrocarbon reserves, and about 65% of the arable land that the planet has. So the potential that this location has is so amazing, and it is so untapped that this could be the basket or the food basket of the world to a set of continent which is going to drive prosperity and solutions for the world. In fact, I was also convinced that, like the solutions for the world tomorrow are not going to come from the global north. They are going to come from the global south. So I'm convinced in my mind that the next set of capitalistic ideas and fundamentally different ideas are going to emerge from places like India, from Africa, and so on and so forth. And so that is where I wanted to understand things. And in terms of you also said that, the trade part within Africa, which was fairly low. If you really look at the intra-regional trade that happens in Europe, it is close to about 56%. And then what you see in Africa is just about 14% in comparison. So the potential that Africa sits on is tremendous. The challenge within Africa was that there was no clear build-up or an understanding of why it is happening. And that is where we said, from an academic viewpoint, let's look at this idea, let's look at this challenge, and let's see if we are able to make a contribution to the growth of the African story for the sake of its people. Because if I can be brutally honest, if Africa fails, humanity fails. And you cannot actually deny that fact. You cannot let humanity fail. You cannot let poverty deride the lives of people. You need to really move forward and make lives better for them, give them the opportunities. It's such a talented place, but underexploited, underutilized resources. And that is where exports could be the driving factor. And that is why I really wanted to look at it. And then, of course, there was also one more thing. Since I had done this work for India and quite a lot of ranking work that happens in India that the government of India was doing, I was working with them on that. I was driving some of the work like innovation and exports. And I felt that Africa becomes a very interesting challenge. And let me just work on this.
And it's interesting because we look now at China and India as South Africa being a very junior member of BRICS and now BRICS Plus, and we look at the models that have been employed quite enviously and we try and replicate them. Certainly the developmental state is often mentioned in South Africa, and if we look at the way India has managed to find export competitiveness, and if you look at the skills that India exports around the world, if you look at business process outsourcing and other industries that India has certainly found a really unique competitive advantages in. But often at an African level, then we say, well, then how do we try and leverage the scale of Africa to try and replicate what very large economies, very large populations such as China and India have done as single countries? And we find there's just so much fragmentation. You try travel across Africa. Amit, I was chatting to the CEO of Airlink, Roger Foster, who bemoaned the fact that we need to open the African skies. He's got to deal with individual civil aviation authorities all over the continent when it's far easier to travel in Europe, as an airline. What do you see as the big challenges before we talk about the opportunities through your research in order to improve Africa's export competitiveness?
So, like when you allude to the point of like what India has done, I must also say that India is a very complex country. Like, of course, India is one single entity, but it also has its 28 different states, 7 union territories. So there are 35 different locations, 35 different governments. So there is a role of the central government, but there is a lot of role from an economic development perspective for the states as well. And that is where Africa can learn. What you need to do is that, can we learn from creating an economic union? You don't have to really say a thing that in terms of saying, oh, the whole of Africa has to be one nation. Like each of the states has its own independent reality, but can we not make it into an economic union wherein movement of land, labor, capital, and data, that should be eased out? Like right now, what we see is it becomes more difficult to travel for Africans within Africa than outside of Africa. So why can't we really ease that pressure? Like, because the moment you open up the borders, wherein you are able to travel and transcend the border, that is where knowledge sharing will start happening. That is where innovation will start happening. And that is where solutions will percolate down from one country to the other. So you have to create that openness. The second thing is in terms of movement of goods. Today, Africa faces a tremendous challenge on movement of goods itself. So how do we really set that movement of goods right? Like, how do we really create that infrastructure to really move things? Africa has close to about 100 ports, but then what we really do notice is that it is only about 2 ports which are in the top ports of the world. If you really look at the Lloyd's report and you find that point. And why does that happen? We need to really fundamentally see that it is because from the interiors of Africa, things are not really moving to those ports because there are those challenges. The cross-border movement of goods is just not happening. So you need to learn from that. And I think European Union is a great example from where we can actually learn and really move forward with. So if you really look at Africa per se, Africa needs to get its fundamental factor conditions right. Once it gets the factor conditions right, once it really gets the education system right, and when you say factor conditions on the labor point of view, Africa is so young. And if we really don't get our education system right, and especially at the foundational learning, you are really going to be talking about fairly difficult times in the years to come. So you need to find solutions for getting the right education at the basic level to really the gross enrollment at the higher level. And that is where talent is actually going to flourish. From an economic viewpoint, and this is the number that I'm going to share from an Indian context, for every additional year of education after class 8 that a person does, it adds close to about 8,000 rupees to your income every year. That's a very tremendous additive that happens. So if you're able to look at it, the kind of impact that these set of things will have over a period of time is tremendous. And I'm not talking about a singular level of impact. It's going to be direct, indirect, and induced impacts, which are going to be huge over a period of time. The multipliers are there to see, but we just need to get the politics right in the location. And if we get the politics right, and if we really get the policy right, things will really start moving into the right direction for Africa.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, having just returned from a couple of trips to Namibia and Botswana, where domestically those economies are not big enough to sustain some of the inward investment that they're starting to see now. In Botswana, for example, there's been a new cap on how much pension funds can invest offshore. And so now the big problem for the head of the Botswana Stock Exchange is, well, how do we create a pipeline of projects for local investment? Because our economy at 2.5 million people just isn't big enough. But if you then broaden the view and say, well, how do we trade more intra-SADC, for example, then you start to get the benefits of those economies of scale. A big part of this, and it's your point, Amit, about political will, does seem to rest on having the political governance and leadership and will to drive this forward. Tiekie, I want to bring you in on that point because we've got the African Continental Free Trade Area.
Free trade.
Yeah. And we've been talking about it for a long time. We have made some progress in terms of reducing tariff barriers, but what are we doing on the non-tariff barriers? What are the key areas where the African Continental Free Trade Area could make a significant difference?
I think the challenge that we have, when the Africa Continental Free Trade Area started in 2021, there was this big dream for this great trade area that we were going to create on the Africa continent. And then it started hitting, some barriers. And I think some of those barriers, as you just mentioned, still very much exist. And I think that if we look now, what are we now, 3 years later on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area? Did it deliver so far? I doubt it. because I think when you speak and you look at the research and you look at some of the figures, and you know what it is, Michael, there's still this huge trust deficit on the Africa continent where we cannot actually get the countries to actually face the hurdles from the AFCFTA perspective and look at how we can together from a collective perspective, try and make a success of the AFCFTA. Because if you look at it, we've got, as Amit also said, 60% of our population is under the age of 25. We work extensively with young entrepreneurs. For us, it's important to try and get them to cross borders and get past those barriers and go and look for new markets, because that is the way that we are going to create localization, I almost want to say, on the Africa continent, to also motivate our young people, you know, to cross borders and create that intra-Africa trade that we're all talking about. And that's not really happening at the scale that it should.
I'm encouraged, though. I mean, yes, we talk about the challenges, and I think you've both articulated them extremely well. But I'm encouraged by what we've seen in terms of a sea change, an attitude change, perhaps since COVID, towards greater reliance on nearshoring, bringing supply chains closer to home because they were so disrupted through COVID. And so there is a window of opportunity when you align that to the fact that we do have the African Continental Free Trade Area, and it is at least moving in the right direction. Just as we're reaching our last few minutes, Amit, maybe just based on the report's recommendations, if you could share what immediate steps should African countries take if you're talking to policymakers right now, presenting the findings to help enhance their export competitiveness? Are there particular policies or strategies that stand out as game changers to you?
Oh, definitely. I think there are about 3 or 4 things that I would really like to share. One is that we need to find a way to improve access to finance. And when I say access to finance, it's about enhancing financial services tailored to the SMEs, because across the world, as we notice, it is SMEs which drive job creation, that drive economies over a period of time. In fact, the whole idea of clusters is also around what I call medium and small enterprise. It's a large anchor firm that can exist, but it's always going to be the medium and small enterprises which are going to drive, because they are going to be becoming large enterprises over a period of time. The second thing is capacity building. And I did allude to that point earlier on as well. And capacity building in terms of training and development, which is going to be very, very critical. But one of the most important points, and that's going to be about innovation. Because, like the fundamental problem across the world from a competitiveness viewpoint that I see is that everybody tends to think that there are high-tech or low-tech sectors. There are nothing like high-tech and low-tech sectors. There are high-tech firms and low-tech firms. Because in agriculture as well, you can do so much. You can be so innovative. You can improve your capacities, productivity over a period of time, and you can still be the food basket for the world. We look at what Israel has been able to do in terms of creating solutions for agriculture. They have been in a very difficult neighborhood. When I say difficult neighborhood, in terms of, say, the land part of it, like they're in a desert, but they're able to create some huge solutions on that. But they created some amazing agriculture-based solutions. We can look at that innovative capacity in Africa. One of the other things that is going to be there is about infrastructure development, and that is going to be very, very critical, and you need to do it now. It's not something that can wait. Market access, and that is what Tiekie also said, but how do we really facilitate access to new markets? And that's within Africa itself. And that is where things are going to be in terms of inclusive entrepreneurship. But last but not the least, you need the right policy. So what I really want to say is advocate and support policies that creates a favorable business environment for the MSMEs or the enterprises. That is where we have the streamlined regulations. You need to remove the anti-competitive market distortions that exist, go deeper into understanding the value chains and see where are those distortions and how do we really solve for it. So if you really look at the aggregated view, what I'm fundamentally saying is that you need to create the enabling environment, let the demand sophistication happen. That is where the markets are going to ask for a few set of solutions. The population is going to ask for solutions. Let's create a dynamic business environment internally. And that is what is going to lead to export performance over a period of time. Because if you're able to create products internally, which are going to be sold in the local market, they are going to be driving a lot of exports over a period of time. If you really look at the United States, like they develop things within their country for their people, and then suddenly it gets exported across the world. It's not that they have created something unique to the world outside. It's always for their internal market, which gets adopted outside. And we need to do the same thing. And there are some unique solutions that are waiting to happen.
And especially at this time when, especially talking about digital-led or technology-enabled business models, that you can develop them at home and they can scale quite rapidly, once you've proven the minimum viable product or concept. From a shared value perspective, Tiekie, how do you see businesses and governments collaborating to implement some of these strategies more effectively? And what role do you see for maybe increased public-private partnership in this regard to try and drive some of these strategies forward?
I think for me, the first thing, and I think this brings us back to why we're having this conversation today about this report that we produced. We need to gather the data. We need to do the research so that we can get our governments and our policymakers and our private sector leaders to make more informed decisions, because that's one of the biggest challenges on the Africa continent is credible data. Amit and myself often talk about that, and that's the reason why this research came to life, is that there's data needed for us to create those policies where our young people can seamlessly cross borders and create those new markets that Amit was talking about now. And that, for me, is the important part from a government perspective. More money needs to be spent on research so that we can get the data together that can help leaders to make more informed decisions. And that it's not just from our shared value perspective. I think there's so many different opportunities as well, Michael, because we at the moment busy looking at gender equality as well, which is also a very, very big part in our shared value world as well. And I think it's, if we look at it, even when I read something the other day, that actually, if you look at the AFCFTA and you look at the contribution that women actually have made to the AFCFTA from a trade perspective, we need to actually look at that as well. But we need research to show to our leaders. That's what we need.
Was it difficult, just on that point, gathering the data for this? And I often, when I chat to entrepreneurs in the fintech space, for example, who are building out financial inclusion sets, and they say, in South Africa, we can get access to data. Retailers have got loyalty programs. When we go into the rest of Africa, we do find data gathering can be a bit more of a challenge. Tiekie?
I think I'm going to have to hand over to Amit on that one, because the reason why Amit and ourselves work together, we obviously came from the shared value world, both of us. And Amit had the background on the research that they've done for India, and that's why he led the research on this. So Amit, I'm handing over to you.
So, Michael, data certainly is a challenge within Africa. If you really look at this report itself, we have done it for 30 countries. We would have loved to do it for 55 countries. I think this is where, as a next step, what we are suggesting is how to create those right set of data protocols across the continent. Because if you're able to do that, then you're able to really look at evidence-based policy making. And that's going to be one of the most critical factors for the future. So data is one of the critical issues, needs to be worked on. Right now, we do see that there are some limitations across 25 odd countries, which we have not covered within the report. We would love to work with them. We are enhancing the processes in terms of really expanding this work to the larger set of countries, which we would over a period of the next 3 years. But again, that is where we are going to be working with governments to really tell them as to what is the data that is required and why it is important for the future. Because if I have the data, then I'm also able to understand what is right within my country, what are the challenges within my country, what kind of policy I need to make, what kind of decisions I should do, what kind of sectors should I really be focusing on. Because if I really don't have that, then I'm actually just hitting in the dark. You cannot be just doing everything under the sun as a country. You need to find your unique advantages across 2, 3, 4 sectors, and that is where you should focus on. And if you're able to do that, then prosperity is something which is going to happen over a period of time. And that's where data be exceedingly important.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm reminded of that old data scientist joke about in God we trust, everyone else bring data. And we need to have a data-driven, evidence-based policy discussion when it comes to Africa and be relying less on gut feel in order to drive these things forward. Thank you very much, Dr. Amit Kapoor, research lead for the report and honorary chairman of the Institute for Competitiveness in India, who's joined by Tiekie Barnard, CEO and founder of Shift Impact Africa. Fantastic insights today. And it's certainly clear that enhancing Africa's export competitiveness, it's not just about economic growth. It's about shaping a far more inclusive and sustainable future. And Africa has an opportunity here, as I do feel there is something of a crisis of capitalism around the world, with deepening inequality, political shifts to the right. And those are all deeply concerning, I think, for the globe. And we have an opportunity to really take the lead. Well, for our listeners, there's plenty to reflect on in the report, whether you're a policymaker, you're a business leader, or if you're just simply interested in Africa's economic development. The insights shared today are a reminder just of the complex and the evolving nature of Africa and our export competitiveness. You can find the report online, full of really interesting and insightful data. And of course, stay tuned to the Monocle Banking Podcast for more in-depth discussions on the key issues shaping the financial and economic landscape. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back with you next week for more on the Monocle Banking Podcast.